are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Iowa may resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm slightly mystified by that, but in any case, I'll try to be aware of that comment. And take us back to Obamacare, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I'd be happy to pick it up at this point. So we have a president who was involved, of course, in the negotiations with the passage of Obamacare, and the question became whether they could put the votes together to pass it here on the floor of the House of Representatives, because it was clear to us that Obamacare was going to fund abortion. And so what emerged from that was a group of Democrats, known later as the Stupak Dozen, or known at the time as the Stupak Dozen, who conditioned their support for the bill upon a provision, which became the Stupak Amendment, that would prohibit abortions funded under Obamacare or required under Obamacare. Well, as that debate ensued, the message became clear that the White House was negotiating that the President would simply sign an executive order that amended Obamacare after it passed, after the fact, and that would fix the Stupak problem. That's the shorthand version, Mr. Speaker, of what took place. But in any case, it was a bit breathtaking to hear that we had a president in the White House who believed that he could sign an executive order to amend legislation after the legislation passed and announce that he was going to do so, which was a condition for it to get the votes in order for it to pass. Now, I know that there are people at home that are listening, Mr. Speaker, that sounds like a lot of legalese gibberish, but it's the fact of what happened. The President, according to the press, had promised that he was going to amend Obamacare by executive order after the fact, so therefore the Stupak language apparently would remain intact, even though it was to be stripped out in the Senate. That's essentially what happened, Mr. Speaker. And we ended up with Obamacare that imposes funding of abortion in all but a very few cases. To give an example, here in the House of Representatives, we are compelled to sign up for Obamacare. If there was a way out of it, I would have found it. And there were 112 different programs to look at. And of those, there were only 9 of them that I could choose from. And of those 9, 8 of them funded abortion. Excuse me. No, there were only 9 that didn't fund abortion. And of those 9, 8 of them didn't cover me. So it came down to this member was compelled to sign up for Obamacare, pay essentially the doubling of my contribution to the premium, and there was the tripling of my deductibility, of my deductibles, for the only policy that at least reportedly didn't fund abortion. Now, we had to dig pretty deeply, and I thank Chris Smith for digging that up and giving us at least that much foundation, or I would have had to buy a pig in a poke, Mr. Speaker. I know that's going on across this country in many, many places. But my point on this is that the President cannot constitutionally amend legislation by executive order, edict, press conference, or a third-tier website announcement from the Department of the United States Treasury. None of those things are consistent with the Constitution. And he continues, as Mr. Gohmert said in his previous discussion in his 1 minute about a half hour ago now, he continues to make alterations not to somebody else's legislation. That's bad enough. I mean, it's all of the same kind of constitutional violation in my view. But when the President decides that he is going to amend Obamacare, that's got his name on it. That's his bill. He signed it. How can he with a straight face step up and say, I'm going to change it on the fly? I'm going to delay the employer mandate. I'm going to delay the individual mandate. I'm going to waive this. I'm going to waive that. I'm going to set different provisions for businesses that have 50 employees and those that have 99 employees and those that are large businesses. And I remember also when he stepped up in a press conference out at the White House, and he had taken a couple weeks of grief for the conscience protection violations that were supposedly in the bill, the Kathleen Sebelius' rules eliminated, and that was a requirement that religious organizations as well had to provide policies and insurance that covered contraceptives, abortifacients, sterilizations. Contraceptives, Mr. Speaker, people understand. Abortifacients are abortion-causing drugs. Sterilizations, we know what they are. These were requirements that were embodied within the rule that HHS rolled out. And after 2 weeks of the religious organizations making the case against that, the President did his press conference noon on a Friday, and he stepped up to the podium and he said, I'm going to make an accommodation to the religious organizations, an accommodation. They don't want to provide these things, so now he said, I am going to require the insurance companies to provide these things for free. The President of the United States had the audacity to step up to the podium and say, I am going to require the insurance companies now to fund contraceptives, abortifacients, and sterilizations for free. Now that's pretty interesting because maybe it just got lost in the language. Maybe the President was really talking about he was going to agree and he was going to ask Congress if Congress would actually change the law. Maybe he thought that he was going to have Kathleen Sebelius publish a different rule that would go out for comment, and once it followed the administrative procedures, it could have the force and effect of law if it fit within the language of the Obamacare legislation. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, maybe we could give the President the benefit of the doubt. But trust but verify. So I went back and checked the rules. The rules that had been published that compelled the religious organizations to follow the path of all of the others to provide for abortifacients and sterilizations and contraceptives. And the President's announcement that he was going to change things now and make an accommodation to the religious organizations and require that these things be provided for free from the insurance companies. And you would think there would have been a proposal for an amendment, a bill to amend Obamacare in Congress. You would think there'd be a change in the rules. But, Mr. Speaker, nothing changed in the rules. There wasn't an I dotted differently. There wasn't a T crossed differently. But the insurance companies began to line up behind the verbal edict of the President. That is breathtaking in scope when you think of it. When you read this Constitution where it says all legislative powers, it doesn't say all legislative powers except those assumed by the President under certain circumstances if he so chooses. It says all legislative powers. And yet, the President is legislating by announcements on websites, by directing his people to change the rules, by verbal press conference that changed nothing, no rules. And he has the temerity to wave his pen at us and say, I have a cell phone and I have a pen, I don't need the Congress. And to make that same statement from the rostrum back here, Mr. Speaker. So I'm very concerned about our Constitution and the violations of it, but the President has time after time after time made changes to Obamacare. It's bad law, and I don't accept the constitutional decision that came down from the Supreme Court. It's got a clear and stark contradiction in it. One day I hope goes back to the court to be reviewed again. But in any case, we've got to adhere to this Constitution. We give an oath to uphold the Constitution, as does the President. It's our job to preserve, protect, and defend it. And here we are faced with the debt ceiling increase. And the reasons that we might be supportive of that increase are in the short term, it gets people off the hook in the short term. But I want a balanced budget amendment attached to it. If we don't get that, let's audit the Fed. If we don't get that, then I would say, here's something we all ought to get behind. Eliminate the bailout of our insurance companies. Our insurance companies wrote into Obamacare that they would be protected from a stop loss, essentially, protected from loss if their actuarial numbers and their premiums don't match up. Now, it would be impossible for them to figure this out because the President has been changing this law all along. Most all of it, the changes have been unconstitutional. I'd make the clearest one would be when the President of the United States decided that he was going to extend the employer mandate a year. Now, the law says, the law that was signed by President Barack Obama says that the employer mandate shall commence in each month after December of 2013. That means it must start January of 2014. We should be in the second month of the employer mandate, and I'm happy enough for the policy to change. I don't think it ever should be implemented. If they bring that extension to this Congress, I would vote for an extension to delay the employer mandate for a year, because that's probably the right kind of policy. We didn't get that before this Congress. Instead, the President just announced he was going to extend it. And I happened to be on a bit of a trip when the notice came that he was going to do some delays of the individual mandate. And I remember sending an email off to one of the top insurance companies. Is anybody there talking about the constitutional violations? The answer that came back was, well, not very much, but yes, he's sure they are talking about it. My answer was, Merry Christmas. This is what we get for Christmas. The President rewriting Obamacare at will. It's ever changing. Months ago, a search of the congressional record will show, Mr. Speaker, that I said, nobody knows what the law is. Nobody knows what Obamacare, the law Obamacare is, because it keeps changing. And of the thousands of pages of regulations that are piled on top of it, on the 2,700 pages of legislation altogether, it's been changed over and over again. The insurance companies can't abide these changes. They can't adjust their premiums, and yet they wrote into the bill the risk corridors. And they say to me, but we have to have this because, after all, if Obamacare is going to be here, we can't be going broke if the President changes the law on us again. That's kind of compressed of the discussion. And I say to them, were you for or against Obamacare when it passed? Their answer is, well, they might check their shoe shine when they answer, and they will say, well, our choice was either to be at the table or on the menu. And so I'm supposed to infer, and the proper inference is they were at the table. The large insurance companies in this country, they weren't just at the table, they were at the White House. And sometimes, and so they decided they didn't want to be on the menu, so they got to the table at the White House and they negotiated their risk corridors, their bailout that protects them from losing money under Obamacare, or at least losing very much money under Obamacare. Well, if they weren't on the menu, they were at the table instead. Who was on the menu, Mr. Speaker? And I would argue that instead of the insurance companies being on the menu, it was the taxpayers that got put on the menu. And we ended up with risk corridors, the bailout for the insurance companies, because they wanted to stay in the large insurance business. And they believe that if they can get the taxpayers to fund the premiums, it's a more reliable premium funding stream than if you have to get that from the individual ratepayers. And also it is designed to put 30 million more people on the insurance rolls. So who that's in the business of expanding their business and trying to get a margin, and I've not been an anti-insurance person. I've paid a lot of premiums and stepped up and done so willingly. They're an important component of the stability in a free enterprise economy. All insurance is, as a matter of fact. But when they drew that protection and wrote that protection in the stop-loss protection called risk corridors in the bailout for the insurance companies into Obamacare, somebody was going to pick up the tab. That's the taxpayers. It expanded their potential universe to 30 million more insureds, 30 million more premiums, and of course there's a profit margin in that, and that's what we're in the business to doing. But you expand those premiums to that 30 million, and the design that came out of Obamacare was that we were going to see more insured. And at this point, I would lay the wager down, Mr. Speaker, that there are fewer people insured today in this country than there was the day that Obamacare was signed into law. And we're losing people continually. And as we see what employers are going to do as they watch the employer mandate kick in over time, delayed now, more employers are going to be dropping people from insurance. More employers are cutting hours. More employers are reducing the number of employees. I happen to know of an employer that had 58 employees, and he lined them up and said, if Obamacare is passed into law and implemented, there will be 49 of you, not 58. That had to have happened all across the country. Businesses that shrunk down to under the 50 mandate, businesses that decided not to grow into that 50 employees where they're mandated to cover their insurance. That's the fact of this life. And if you have more than those in employees, and then the formerly 40-hour work week, which has been used to measure a full-time worker, was reduced under Obamacare to 30 hours. 30 hours, not 40. So we ended up with people that are getting 28 hours, that are working 28 hours a week, so that they're underneath the mandate, and the employer then, who can't afford the premiums often for this higher cost health insurance, can keep his employees on. So here are the circumstances. There might be somebody that's got a job, and they could be working, let's just say, about 48 or 50 hours a week, a little overtime, time and a half overtime on that. I've done the math on this, Mr. Speaker. But running in at about 50 hours a week, the employer looks at that and says, I can't afford the health insurance. This federal mandate is either going to take me out of business or I'm going to have to lower your hours. So he looks at his full-time employees and says, sorry, you're part-time, you're 28 hours, you're 28 hours, you're 28 hours. Well, he needs more employees to fill up the production, so he goes and hires more part-time workers. Well, that's a good thing for some people, but those that had a full-time job and were getting time and a half overtime, and then they get their hours cut. The person who was working 50 hours now is now down to 28. They have to go get another part-time job that maybe is another 28 hours. Now they're up to 56 or 60 hours, but they don't have health insurance with 2 jobs. Then maybe that's dad. And mom's in the same circumstance. She's been cut. She's got to have another job. So now we have mom and dad trying to raise a family when each were maybe working 50 hours a week with some overtime. Now they're working 56 hours a week in 2 jobs with transportation and the shuttle schedules, 4 jobs for 2 people to raise a family. Those circumstances are emerging today under Obamacare, Mr. Speaker, and it's wrong. We need to raise that minimum, that 40-hour standard, or that 30-hour standard for full-time, that mandate up to 40. That's an essential component of Obamacare. I'd attach that to the debt ceiling. Any one of these, one at a time, all together, I'm fine with. 40-hour work week. Another one, Mr. Speaker, is this. Full deductibility for everybody's health insurance premiums. It has always been wrong that a certain percentage of the American populace has had to buy their health insurance with after-tax dollars. And I've done this for years. That as an employer, I started a construction company in 1975. We provided health insurance for our employees, but I couldn't deduct the premium for me unless I wrote up unless I incorporated, put myself in a salary and wrote off those wages. I wanted to stay a sole proprietor for a number of reasons, but I couldn't deduct my health insurance premiums. And so the business expense of premiums for my employees, legitimate expense just like wages, salary and benefits, write those off, but I couldn't write off my own. So Marilyn and I had to pay for health insurance with after-tax dollars, that piece that's left after you pay Uncle Sam, after you pay the governor, the take-home pay, so to speak, after you pay the payroll tax. The take-home pay is what I had to pay my health insurance with, not deductible. Now, here we are in this circumstance where that's bad. And it should have been changed a long time ago because it's an injustice and inequity. But now we have Obamacare that mandates that individuals buy that health insurance. And it's a federal mandate. You shall buy this health insurance. Now, in my case, it isn't that I go out in the marketplace and shop for a health insurance policy. It's that if I'm going to comply with the law, I've got one choice. One choice only. That's not competition. That was, by the way, one of the reasons that the President wanted to pass Obamacare, is so there'd be more competition. He wanted to have a federal health insurance company to compete with the private sector companies so that there'd be more competition. I don't know if anybody's talked about this in quite some time here on the floor. It's the President's plan. Well, I had one choice, but to have the federal government impose that you buy a product that's either produced or approved by the federal government, and they take out of your check, they commandeer your take-home pay to pay that premium. And while that's going on, an employer somewhere, often a large corporation, can deduct that same premium to all their people as a business expense, but ma and pa operation, family farm, whoever it might be, they can't. It puts them at a significant disadvantage. This country needs to provide for full deductibility of everybody's health insurance premiums. It's immoral to compel someone to buy a product that's produced or approved by the federal government, and it's even more immoral, Mr. Speaker, to say to them, and the money that you shall pay shall be after-tax dollars, and I'm going to send the IRS in to audit you and make sure that you're paying that premium with after-tax dollars, and if not, we're going to levy a tax against you. It was just going to be a penalty, but now it was convenient to make the argument before the Supreme Court that it's a tax. We have a whole series of things that we could do. The debt ceiling is in front of us. There's an increase that's being pushed at us. If the President's people in this Congress think a clean debt ceiling is a good idea, they should step up and all of them pledge to vote for it. I think we might find enough Republicans that would vote for a clean debt ceiling increase. If not, Mr. Speaker, I'd suggest that we put a balanced budget amendment on that and send it over to Harry Reid. If that doesn't work, then I'd suggest that we resurrect Ron Paul's legislation, audit the Fed, attach that to the debt ceiling, send it over there. If that doesn't work, then I would put the elimination of the bailouts for health insurance companies on there and send it over to the Senate. And if that doesn't work, then I would take the 30-hour work week, which is supposedly the standard for full-time. I'd change that to 40 so that Mom and Dad who were working 50 hours, now that are working 56 hours or 60 hours each, can hang on to just one job, not two each, and they would get, instead of having their hours cut from 50 to 28 or maybe even 40 to 28, that they could keep their full-time job and go to work and manage their lives and their schedules. And by the way, this argument that Obamacare, according to the CBO, Obamacare cuts the job equivalent by 2.5 million jobs over the course of a decade. So that's also appalling and breathtaking, Mr. Speaker. To think that this Obamacare that was going to create 4 million jobs, according to then Speaker Pelosi, now is going to reduce by 2.5 million jobs. That's 6.5 million jobs off from what was predicted compared to what we now have a better look at, what we're likely to end up with. And I won't say that number is certain. It might be substantially greater than that. 2.5 million jobs. So how does the administration spin this? You would think that they would find an alternative number and argue the CBO's score. Or you would think that they would find a way to point out that somehow these definitions don't quite match up just right. Well, they looked around pretty hard to find a way to rebut the CBO's numbers and came up empty, and so they settled on the spin. The spin, Mr. Speaker, which is this: 2.5 million jobs. Think of this. All of those people that don't have to work as much because we're borrowing money from the Chinese to subsidize the health insurance premium that we require that they pay to buy the insurance under Obamacare. And so they'll understand that if they stay under a certain threshold, they'll get a federal premium subsidy to buy their Obamacare. So it won't pay for them to work as many hours as they did before. And when you reduce this all down and get people under the 30-hour work week, which I just finished discussing, then they'll have more time to spend with their families, more time to play with their children, more time to paint, more time to muse about the esoteric things in life. Maybe we'll have more people that are pontificating about metaphysics for this price of losing 2.5 million jobs. Well, it's a good thing we have people working less in America. That's the core argument for this administration. It's a good thing that we have people working less in America because of Obamacare. It gives them more free time. Well, if working less is a good idea, I guess that fits with their philosophy, because we have heard from the minority whip as well as a number of other people. In fact, I believe it would also be the former speaker, say this: unemployment, food stamps and unemployment are the two quickest way you get economic stimulus, the quickest way to grow the economy. Now, when I first heard that, it was shocking to me that anybody could say that out loud and perhaps believe it. But how do food stamps stimulate the economy? How do unemployment checks stimulate the economy? An economy has to produce goods and services that have a marketable value here and abroad. And if you borrow money abroad to pay people not to produce goods and services, let alone those with a marketable value, you are building a nation of debt and a nation of people who, if they have job skills, are atrophying because they're not using them. And as technology increases, they get further and further behind by not maintaining the skills they have and not keeping their skills up to date as technology as it moves. This idea that this is only a consumer-driven economy, this Keynesian concept of, let's just say, we can't audit the Fed, but they can inject in QE 1, 2, and 3 trillions of dollars into this economy, and because a lot of the world is afraid to invest, therefore we haven't seen inflation take a hold in this way yet. But the Fed can inject the money into QE3, and then the federal government can do an economic stimulus plan like the President's $825 billion that went north of that. I guess it was $787 billion that got to $825 billion. Inject this money into the economy, spend this money, and it's going to stimulate the economy, and this growth will eventually create enough tax money that you work your way out of debt. The problem with that is, Mr. Speaker, it has never succeeded. There's no existing model of a Keynesian experiment that has ever brought a country, an economy, out of an economic recession. We're in the 5th year of this recovery. I guess you can say that we're coming out of the economic recession of 2008. We've had this slow improvement in unemployment numbers that has taken place. We're down there in the 6s somewhere. We've watched as the number of 15 million unemployed has worked its way down by 1 million here, 1 million there. A year ago there were 12 million unemployed. Today, according to the most recent report, there are 10.2 million unemployed. Actually, it's been a full 2 million people less on unemployment rolls. But the monthly job increases that we've seen, 74,000 last month, a little over 100,000 this month, not nearly enough to keep pace, Mr. Speaker. And this growth has been down there to where if you look at the last 4 to 5 years, the GDP increase in the economy has been greater in Mexico than it has the United States. And as I listen to some of the some of the self-appointed economic experts, they'll explain to us that we need to import more people into the United States that have low or no skill and likely are illiterate in their own language to do the work that Americans don't want to do in this country, because, and in doing so will stimulate our economy and increase our fertility rate. We know who those people are, Mr. Speaker, that seem to think that. Much of this concept is just simply wrong. Keynesian economics is wrong. The idea of an open borders economic stimulator is wrong. What is right is the understanding of first principles, the understanding of the pillars of American exceptionalism, the understanding that put those parameters in place by our founding fathers well more than 200 years ago, when they saw that we had to have the rule of law in America. Without the rule of law, we're not a lot different than third world countries. And we're a nation of laws and not of men. And our laws need to be applied equally to all of us. The problem we have today is it looks like those who are, let's say, not favored by the current administration have to fear the law more than those who are favored. One of those examples would be the IRS, Mr. Speaker. Our founding fathers would have never envisioned an IRS in the first place. It took a constitutional amendment to even provide for it, the 16th Amendment. I introduced that resolution each year to repeal the 16th Amendment, and one day I hope to see that done. But in the meantime, our founding fathers imagined that there would be taxes gathered through other means and that the government would be limited. Our Constitution is the very description of limited government. The concept of federalism, Mr. Speaker, sometimes needs to be defined and described, especially so young people understand federalism is the devolution of power out to the political subdivisions, to the states or respectively to the people. A limited federal government with enough power to protect our borders and our shores, to leave us as much as possible otherwise alone, and let the states and their political subdivisions and the people solve those problems so that the laboratories of the states can be where the experiments are taking place. They are to some degree. I see some of these experiments. There are some states that have some healthy experiments, and one of them is Texas, no income tax, a dynamic economy, one that has shown that it's demonstrated to be a big chunk of the growth in our GDP and the growth of employment in the country because they run a free and fair government in Texas and no income tax. Florida is a state with no income tax. South Dakota is a state with no income tax. They seem to be destination states for people that are seeking to get out of the high tax states like Illinois, California. The models of the states that are in economic difficulty. And additionally, Mr. Speaker, we've seen some cities that have been run by that Keynesian philosophy of borrow, tax, and spend, get to the point of collapse and ruin. Detroit among them. A great, great American city with a tremendous legacy, a vibrant tone within the history of America, shuffled down into bankruptcy and with grass growing in the streets of the city because they didn't take care of their finances. That's what's in store for entire states if they don't turn the corner. That's what's in store for this country if we don't turn the corner. Mr. Speaker, I'm quite concerned that politics here in the House of Representatives is downstream from the culture. Politics in any legislative body is generally downstream from the culture. Yes, we have leaders here. We have leaders that step up and strike the right tone and chart the right course. But they would not be followed unless the culture provided the directive. This American experiment, this grand country that we are, is dependent upon the people in this country understanding what made us great, preserving and protecting and refurbishing those pillars of American exceptionalism that can sustain a greatness into the future above and beyond anything that we've achieved today. That's what's in store for us if we teach our children well, if we teach them responsibility of work, if we teach them the core of our faith, the faith that laid the foundation for America, the faith that will see us through any trials, the foundation for the family, the ideal way to raise children, a mom and a dad and a family raising their children with love and setting the standard for them and setting the standard, by the way, of work as well as morality. And this country can come back again, but we need to teach American history, the pillars of American exceptionalism. We need to do it from inside out, from the family on out, and those young people need to emerge as the leaders in all walks of life, from the educational to the journalism to the production, and we need to revere and respect all work. All work has honor, all work has dignity, and we need to put a lot more Americans back to work. There are over 101 million Americans of working age who are simply not in the workforce. We don't need to import more people to do the work Americans won't do. We need to provide the incentive for Americans to step up and shoulder the burden with the rest of us. That's more important. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll see how the debt ceiling unfolds. I've offered a number of options, and appreciate your attention, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, once again, it's an honor and a privilege to come to the floor of the House of Representatives and to anchor this Congressional Black Caucus Special Order in partnership with my co-anchor, the distinguished gentleman from Nevada, Representative Stephen Horsford, where for the next 60 minutes, members of the Congressional Black Caucus will have the opportunity to speak directly to the American people about an issue of great consequence and great significance for our country, for our economy, for our future, and for our well-being, and that is the debt ceiling. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is a Yogi Berra moment. It's deja vu all over again. Time and time and time again, we've been forced to come to the floor of the House of Representatives and urge our colleagues on the other side of the aisle not to plunge this country into a painful default and risk the full faith and credit of the United States of America for the first time in the history of the Republic. And whenever we've been forced to have this conversation, we are always put into a position where we need to clarify what the debt ceiling is really all about, because it's been subject to a lot of misrepresentation. The debt ceiling is not a backward, forward-looking vehicle. that is designed to give the President the opportunity to spend more. It is a backward-looking vehicle designed to give the President the opportunity to pay bills that the Congress has already incurred. Bills that were incurred during the previous decade, bills that were incurred during the 8 years of the Bush administration, during which time our good friends on the other side of the aisle were in control of both the House and the Senate, and we'll go into that in greater detail as we move forward. Let's have an honest conversation about the realities that we face concerning the debt in this country in excess of $17 trillion. There's reason for us to be concerned about it, but let's not manipulate the facts as to how we found ourselves into this situation. I'm pleased that we've been joined by a very distinguished member of the Congress and of the freshman class. In fact, we affectionately refer to him as the ranking member of the CBC freshman class in the 113th Congress. I'm pleased now to yield to my good friend, Representative Donald Payne, Jr.
Thank you to my colleague, the gentleman from New York, and the gentleman from Nevada for their continuous leadership on these CBC special orders. I am honored to join them once again on a topic that is paramount right now in our nation's history, and also a situation that we must deal with in a manner to keep this nation moving forward. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to ask my friends on the other side of the aisle to do one simple thing. It is something that we expect from every American, and every person in this country expects it from us. That simple thing I am asking for, Mr. Speaker, is for Congress to pay our nation's bills on time. There should be no resistance, no strings attached, no threats of default. Americans deserve better than to have the full faith and credit of the United States of America held hostage so that some of my Republican colleagues can demand ransom for their radical agenda. Mr. Speaker, the full faith and credit of the United States is non-negotiable, period. And so I'm urging this Congress to raise the debt ceiling swiftly and to do it with no strings attached. Only recent in our nation's history has the debt ceiling been used as a reckless bargaining chip. In fact, since the great hero of the other side, Ronald Reagan, took office, the debt ceiling has been raised 45 times. It is nothing new, and it is nothing radical. Now, the allegations put out there about what raising the debt ceiling will do to our deficit are at best misleading. The debt ceiling does not grow. The debt ceiling does not grow our deficit by one single dime. Rather, what it does is permit the government to pay what this Congress has already decided to spend. We had the credit card. We used the credit card. Now it's time to pay our nation's bills and pay them on time. So, Mr. Speaker, raising the debt ceiling is, in fact, the fiscally responsible thing to do here. If we default, the cost to American families will be significant. 26 million Americans won't get their Social Security checks on March 3rd. I'll repeat that. 26 million Americans will not get their Social Security checks on March 3rd. There are 1.5 million seniors, children, and disabled New Jerseyans who receive Social Security to help make ends meet, and many of them will not see their checks if this is not followed through. Nearly 4 million veterans may not receive their disability benefits, including 50,000 veterans in New Jersey. Now, the other side of the aisle needs to take these things seriously. They talk about supporting veterans. They talk about supporting working families. They talk about all of these values. But if the debt ceiling is not raised, these families will not get the support and the benefit that they need to make ends meet. So, Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon the members on the other side of the aisle, instead of just talking the talk, walk the walk. New Jersey families will have to pay higher interest rates for mortgages, auto loans, student loans, and credit cards. Many families in my district already can't afford to send their children to college. A default would put a college education either further out of reach. I'm hopeful that my Republican colleagues have learned their lesson from the last default threat in 2011 and from shutting down the government last year. The last time that we even threatened to default in 2011, the economy flew into a tailspin. The markets plummeted, consumer confidence took a nosedive, and our credit rating was downgraded. Our economic recovery came to a screeching halt because of it. In an already fragile recovery, we cannot afford another possible meltdown of our economy. And so I am urging my Republican colleagues to help try and set an example, to hope they have learned their lesson from last year where they shut down the federal government. Let's pay our nation's bills on time, Mr. Speaker. If we demand this kind of responsibility from the American people, then we should demand it from ourselves. And I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey for walking us through some of the episodes that the American people have been subjected to as a result of the extreme behavior that has been articulated and enacted, in fact, as part of the agenda put forth by the majority over the last 2 terms. It's time, Mr. Speaker, to end the irresponsibility, end the recklessness, end the extremism, end the brinksmanship, so that we can get back to doing the business of the American people with a fiscally responsible, sustainable course, but one that recognizes that here in this Congress, time and time again, we have inflicted wounds on the economy and on the American people. We did it last spring in advance of sequestration taking effect. We were warned by independent economists that if you allow sequestration to take effect, $85 billion in random cuts spread out without reason across the economy, it would cost us approximately 750,000 jobs. But yet it happened. And then we were warned that it would be problematic if you allowed the government to shut down. And yet, nonetheless, some people couldn't help the recklessness, the irresponsibility, the extremism, and so the government was shut down for 16 days. Standard & Poor's estimated that it cost us $24 billion in lost economic productivity. And yet here we are again, a Yogi Berra moment, deja vu, all over again, confronting another manufactured, man-made, unnecessary crisis. Just lift the debt ceiling, consistent with what has happened time and time again across Democratic and Republican administrations. Mr. Speaker, let me yield now to our good friend, the co-anchor of this CBC special order, the distinguished gentleman from the Silver State, my good friend, Representative Horsford.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my good friend and colleague from the great state of New York, Mr. Jeffries, and for your leadership in anchoring this hour on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus and to bring the American people into a very important conversation about what the House of Representatives should be doing, as you talked about tonight, and that is, Mr. Speaker, raising the debt ceiling and averting another crisis. We are here tonight to urge our colleagues on the other side to work with Democrats and the administration to pass a clean and swift debt ceiling expansion without delay. The Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Lieu, emphasized in a letter to congressional leadership on last Friday that no Congress in our history has failed to meet this responsibility, and it would be a mistake to wait until the last possible minute to act. And why should we act, Mr. Speaker? Why should we delay in acting? This Congress, unfortunately being known as the Do-Nothing Congress, has failed to pass more bills than other previous sessions of Congress, at a time when the American public expect their elected officials to work together to get things done under the leadership of the majority. Fewer than 60 bills that have been passed by Congress have ultimately become law in the last year. And now we're here facing yet another self-imposed, self-inflicted crisis. As my colleague Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Payne have said, this is nonsense. The American public is looking at Congress and saying, do your job. The Treasury Department has made clear that it will exhaust all extraordinary measures in meeting our country's final financial obligations by February 27th. And the House, this House, is only in session for 5 more days between now and then, Mr. Speaker. That is why we're here to urge our Republican colleagues to act, to raise the debt ceiling now, to do it swiftly, to do it without putting our country's debt or full faith and credit of the United States at risk. As my colleagues have said, we have to raise the debt, and it is not for negotiation. Let us remember that the debt ceiling has been raised 45 times since President Ronald Reagan took office. It doesn't grow our deficits by a single dime. All it does is allow the Treasury to pay for what this Congress has already spent and the obligations previous Congresses have already made on behalf of the United States. Now, there has already been much talk about Speaker Boehner turning something that could be very simple into a hostage situation with sweeping concessions. So I would hope that my Republican colleagues remember the damage that was caused the last time we debated increasing the debt ceiling. And the fact that House Republicans are debating among themselves another demand to hold our full faith and credit of the United States hostage is outrageous. And as we've stated before, Mr. Speaker, House Democrats agree with President Obama that the full faith and credit of the United States is non-negotiable. I stand with House Democrats in support of a clean debt ceiling increase that ensures the full faith and credit of the United States of America and avoids having this Congress play political games and brinksmanship. We've said it before and we'll say it again. We should be representing the people's best interest, not punishing them. There are drastic implications to not passing this debt ceiling increase by February 27th, and I want to yield time back to my colleague, Mr. Jeffries, for us to be able to highlight some of these damaging consequences. I know in my home state of Nevada, it would mean an average increase in mortgage rates, leaving the average home buyer to pay an additional $100 a month, costing families $36,000 over the lifetime of a typical 30-year mortgage. 85,267 Nevada residents took out a home mortgage or refinanced their existing mortgage in the past year. All of them would be subject to these increases in mortgage interest rates. So this is just one example of one state and the families that would be impacted. This is the type of impact that would happen across our nation. The consequences are real. It's time for our colleagues on the other side to stop playing games, increase the debt ceiling, meet our obligations. I yield back time to my colleague.
Yeah, I thank the distinguished gentleman for pointing out some of the catastrophic consequences that the American people will be forced to endure if we fail to raise the debt ceiling and force a default and threatening the full faith and credit of the United States of America for the first time in the history of the Republic. I just want to go over some of the things that would be at stake, as a few of my colleagues have already laid out, but it bears re-emphasis. The Social Security payments owed to the American people will be jeopardized by a failure to raise the debt ceiling. Veterans' benefits will be jeopardized by a failure to raise the debt ceiling. Mortgage interest rates could increase as a result of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. Automobile loan interest rates could increase as a result of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. Credit card payments as a result of an increase in interest connected to debt that's held on American Express or MasterCard or Visa or any of the other credit cards that the American people have could increase as a result of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. This is not an esoteric concept. This is something that will have a real impact on the American people, and that's why we need a debt ceiling increase consistent with what every Congress and every American president has done since the founding of this country. Now, I want to read into the record and then perhaps have my good friend react to it, a presidential letter that relates to this debt ceiling issue, and it reads in part, "This country now possesses the strongest credit in the world. The full consequences of a default, or even the serious prospect of default, by the United States are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. Denigration of the full faith and credit of the United States would have substantial effects on the domestic financial markets and on the value of the dollar in exchange markets. The nation can ill afford to allow such a result." This is a letter that was written on November 16, 1983, by President Ronald Reagan, addressed to then Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker. President Reagan, I believe my good friends on the other side of the aisle have deified him as a fiscal warrior, a true conservative. Yet we know that Ronald Reagan raised the debt ceiling 18 times during his presidency, and in this letter to Senator Baker lays out in bold, uncompromising terms the consequences of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. This is not a partisan issue. We as Democrats are not standing here on the floor of the House of Representatives because we want to beat up the other side. We're here to defend the best interests of the American people, east, west, north, south, rural America, urban America, and suburban America, because the consequences of a failure to raise the debt ceiling will hurt everybody. And so if the distinguished gentleman from Nevada could just react to the notion that this is somehow a partisan issue that needs to be discussed, so that President Obama is being fiscally irresponsible by requesting that Congress do its constitutional duty.
Thank you. I appreciate my good friend for yielding. And the remarks by the former president, President Reagan, speak to the reality of the consequence of Congress failing to act and what that will mean to our economy, to average Americans, to businesses, to the global economy because of the role that the United States plays, and to the value of the dollar. And to somehow hold this process hostage because members on the other side have still not come to terms that the election is over, the president won, and it is time for this Congress to work with him to move our country forward. Not to use this as another means to extract more concessions or demands in order for you to do your job. You don't have to agree with President Obama on everything, but what you do have to do is your job on behalf of the American people that elected you. Now, while no one knows with certainty the full extent of the damage to the economy should the U.S. default on its debts, and we don't know because it's never happened, because every other Congress, regardless of party, regardless of which party controls the White House or the administration at a given time, did its job to extend and raise the debt. What we do know is that the average American family will feel a significant negative impact. And we're not here to scare our constituents. Our constituents are going through enough every day trying to survive, to make ends meet, to put food on the table, working hard for themselves and their families. But what we are here to do is to talk about what some of the potential impacts might be. And so let me highlight that. If you look for a moment at this chart, this graphic provides some explanation. What are the debt ceiling deniers missing? Household wealth would decrease by $1 trillion if we fail to raise the debt ceiling. Retirement assets would drop by $800 billion at a time when people are trying to provide a security for themselves and their future. A decision by this Congress to fail to raise the debt ceiling could result in $800 billion of retirement assets declining. We've talked about an increase in interest rates for borrowers at a time when our housing market is beginning to recover from the prolonged recession. Why would this Congress fail to act and the consequence of that result in increased mortgage rates for home owners and borrowers? And a huge hit for financial markets around the globe, causing the Dow Jones and the S&P to plummet. Families' retirement savings and 401ks would drop as the stock market plummets. 3.4 million veterans who could not receive the disability payments. 10 million Americans not receiving Social Security checks on time in just the first week alone. Delayed tax refunds for up to 110 million Americans. And drug reimbursements under Medicare stopping, and doctors and hospitals not getting paid. All for what? So that our colleagues on the other side who don't like the results of an election can use the debt ceiling as another attempt to get more concessions and more demands for things and ideas that have already been rejected by the American public. So, Mr. Speaker, we're here to say enough is enough already. Let's get to work. Let's make 2014 a year of action, not obstruction. And it starts by increasing the debt ceiling, meeting our obligations, and not doing harm to an already fragile economy and to an American public that expects their representatives to act in their best interest, not more political grandstanding or gamesmanship. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentleman for a very thorough explanation and for the illustration